Okay, we're going to make a start. I'm Hannah Grayson. I'm one of the team here at Stirling, and I just want to reiterate the welcome from all of us who work here. It is such a delight to have so many friends and colleagues on our campus, and welcome to those joining online too. I'm sure we've all had a really full and long and tiring and interesting day, but we've still got energy and appetite. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lydie, who's going to give this evening's plenary lecture. So Professor Lydie Moudileno is Marion Francis Chevalier Professor of French and Chair of the Department of French and Italian at the University of Southern California, where she holds secondary appointments as Professor in American Studies and Ethnicity and Professor in Comparative Literature. Lydie's work has focused on representations of Blackness, authorship, post-colonial France, narratives of diaspora. She's published on multiple authors, including Maryse Condé and Marion, and she continues to publish on questions of genre and categorization in African fiction. Most recently, 2 co-edited volumes have addressed a huge breadth of engagement in popular culture with questions of France's colonial legacies. In 2018, she published with Etienne Achille a study of colonial signs in the 21st century inspired by Barthes. Mythologie postcoloniale, décoloniser le quotidien. Then in 2020, a really significant volume exploring the material and immaterial traces of empire in the French-speaking world, post-colonial realms of memory, signs and symbols in modern France, again with Etienne and with Charles Forsdyck. Both of these indicate, I think, the work Lydie does to interrogate the post and decolonial within the very specific set of circumstances shaping the French Republic today, and the relevance of that work to both English and French language scholarly communities. Questions she asks and offers us as scholars of French studies, memory studies, post-colonial studies, and all the other overlapping fields of interest that draw us here this week have included: what kinds of signs lay hidden in the everyday, constructing and reconstructing racial mythologies in contemporary France? What might we have overlooked as lieux de mémoire in our collective repertoires for remembering France's pasts? Which new modes of reading and writing Africa offer us ways of rendering that continent less fantôme and more imaginable or présent? And most recently, how might she and we use poaching as method to question the epistemic privilege of certain theorists and our own ambivalence towards them? Those of us lucky enough to also feel at home in the Society for Francophone Postcolonial Studies continue to benefit indirectly from Lydie's work in the next generation of scholars who have benefited from her PhD supervision. As that society has seen more colleagues join us from across the Atlantic over the last few years, we've enjoyed the rigor and originality of scholarship on, for example, zombies in the contemporary Caribbean, in fiction on the contemporary Caribbean, and post-Cold War mediations of violence. And this work is marked, and as its authors tell me, directly impacted by Lydie's generosity of spirit and excellent guidance. And so the influence goes on for our undergraduate students. So most recently this past year, Nina and I taught a new course to Stirling undergraduates on memory studies in the French-speaking world. And we asked the students to find a point d'entrée via different chapters of the Postcolonial Realms of Memory volume. And we just found it such a wonderful, and if it's not an insult, usable text that really brought big questions about French culture, memory, and politics to life for our students. And that volume, which I'm sure many of us have dipped into, is indicative of Lydie's commitment to collaborative research, the breadth of her expertise, and of the incisive contribution she continues to make to the overlapping fields I've mentioned. And so perhaps to continue the royal threads of our first plenary session yesterday, we're very much looking forward to your lecture, Lydie, which is titled Black Royalty in Decolonial Times. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this inspired and generous introduction. I always also appreciate the acknowledgement of my work, our work as advisors and mentors to students. It's important. I am delighted to be here. It's my second time in Stirling. I was here, I guess, a decade ago, visiting the department, and David, my dear colleague, David Murphy. I'm also delighted because I should have been here last year. The theme was different. I hope my presentation today kind of still fits into the theme of death. I think the royalty I'm going to talk about, most of them are dead, so that should fit in the theme. So thank you for the renewed invitation. I want to thank my colleagues, Diana Holmes, the president of the society, and our colleague and host, Nina Parrish, here at Stirling. And again, thanks, Anna. So you've heard about my research through Anna's presentation. What I'm going to present today is part of a new project on what I call tentatively new Afrocentrisms in the 21st century. And the figures or images of representations of royalty figure very prominently in this research. This could have been my opportunity to speak, to present in French. I don't get to do that a lot in the United States, but I prepared in English. As a result, my presentation might not be as lively, perhaps, as a kind of more improvised French delivery. I'm going to read more. I will feel more comfortable reading, but I'm also happy to engage in French in the Q&A session. Okay, so Black royalty in decolonial times. Among the many striking stories in Barack Obama's first autobiography, Dreams of My Father, I remember being particularly taken with one anecdote. It goes back to a difficult time in the young Obama's life while he's living with his maternal grandparents in Hawaii. At school, he experiences isolation and marginality as the new kid on the block, but also as the only black boy in the prep school. At some point, a compassionate and well-intentioned teacher tries to connect with the young Obama and asks him during class, "Which tribe is your father from in Kenya?" As the boy gives a mumbled answer, the answer is Luo tribe, the class bursts into wild laughter and makes monkey sounds, leaving him completely mortified. The only time another kid would talk to him at the end of the day is to ask if his father ate people. More than a bullying story from school, the anecdote resonates with me also because it does not end on this humiliating interaction. A few months later, when things are getting better and the boy is starting to make some friends, his Kenyan father announces that he will be in town to visit. Determined to avoid another round of monkey sounds and talks of cannibalism, the boy takes the lead. And when announcing his father's visit, he declares at the cafeteria table, "My father, he's a prince," all the while knowing that it's untrue. The lie works beautifully. Now, the supposed royal lineage would elevate the boy's status. It would set him apart from the classmates and immediately distinguish him from other African. His blackness at school now summoned only through evocations of mysterious majesty and grandeur. Of course, Freud would say, as he did in his famous essay on family romance, that this is something that kids do. They invent different parents for themselves, illustrious ones, in order to deal with familial relationships which they find frustrating, or for which they substitute a fantasy world of their own making. But Freud was referring to the daydreaming activity, and in most cases, the fantasy is quickly exposed for what it is. Why then, one might ask, why did the statement, "my father is a prince," go unchallenged at school for Obama? What is it that made it so immediately plausible coming from the black boy? I think it works, and it works in the same way the internet scam of Nigerian princes works, because it feeds into an imaginary of black royalty which has circulated for centuries outside of Africa. In the case of Obama, it actually functions at the convergence of a double imaginary. One, a European imaginary about African princes, and second, the imaginary of the African diaspora, where metaphors, allegories, and real historical figures of black royalty have been deployed in various contexts up until the 21st century. So to begin, I'll give a brief reminder of the first one, the European imaginary. Early modern narratives and iconography about African people are dominated by the familiar representation elaborated through countless iterations of all sorts of savages. The European Bibliothèque the European Bibliothèque coloniale, to use Valentin Moudibé's term, portrays a continent full of primitive bodies, ferocious fighters, eroticized creatures, and Calibanistic brutes. There is no need for me to dwell on the racist rhetorics which undergirds these. By contrast, less attention has been paid to the multiplicity of kings, queens, princes, and princesses who also populate the colonial library, and sometimes alongside depictions of savages. But in fact, European travelers and explorers, upon returning to their homelands, breathlessly shared with their European audiences accounts of multiple encounters with African monarchs. And often they insisted on the refinement they perceived in their hosts, in the way their bodies are adorned, in their use of gold and other precious metals and materials, in the nobility of their postures, and in the overall gravitas which emanates from their person. In all these cases, and here you have representation, an image of a king of Gezo, king of Dahomey. In all these cases, the distinction of the African king, as described by the explorer or the traveler, recalls a contrast Foucault established, stating that the barbarian is the opposite of the savage. And I quote, "The savage is basically a savage who lives in a state of savagery together with other savages. The barbarian, in contrast, is someone who can be understood, characterized, and refined only in relation to a civilization and by the fact that he exists outside of it." That's Foucault in Society Must Be Defended. In other words, the barbarian is, in contrast with the savage, a potentially civilized other who can enter in cultural and political relation with his European counterparts. Leader of the collective hordes of savages, the barbarian carries with him and with his royalty the possibility of human recognition at the individual level, which the savages do not. This distinction actually runs through European literature, drama, and opera, culminating perhaps, for what interests me with the black royalty, with abolitionist literature in the late 18th century. This distinction is at the core of the bestseller Orinoco the Royal Slave, A True History by oops, what happened to my, okay, it disappeared, sorry. Orinoco the Royal Slave, A True History by Afraben, that's in 1688, which established the trope of the paradigm of the royal slave in a modern and transatlantic context. It is a narrative where affirmations of the humanity and the dignity recovered by the enslaved body is predicated precisely upon the aristocratic lineage. It's a condition of the recognition of their humanity. 2 centuries later, the young Victor Hugo offers another variance with Bourg-Jargal, the story of an enslaved African king, Pierrot or Bourg-Jargal, set during the Haitian Revolution. It is quite telling that Bourg-Jargal was translated in English under the title The Slave King, echoing Afraben's title, The Royal Slave. And I thought I had visuals for you today, but I do not. I promise many more. So second, in the diaspora, and by diaspora I mean outside of Europe and outside of Africa, which is the cultural realm that I'm going to focus on today. Outside of Europe and outside of Africa, Black royals, kings, queens, princes, and princesses abound in the diasporic imagination. And in fact, mobilizing signs, emblems, figures, and aesthetics of royalty in order to assert Black pride has been a recurring gesture in diasporic cultural, political, and intellectual history. In one of the few essays on the subject, scholar Gary Griffith identified in 2009 what he calls the trope of African chiefly descent, or the trope of African royal descent, or the trope of the African prince. Those are the terms that he offers. Griffith's focus is on African students abroad, so very close to sort of like the Obama anecdote I started with. But we see, in fact, that such a trope, the trope of the African of chiefly descent, has been deployed in a stunning variety of ways by generations of visual artists, novelists, and musicians from the United States and from the Caribbean, including the Francophone, to sustain different modes of racial distinction. The Obama anecdote with which I opened this paper is a case in point. In order to, so I had some, I wanted to share this. I'm a little bit, okay, so these pertain actually to European representations. You see here, I'm still in Dahomey, King Gezo, and these are some of the portraits of King Béanzin that appear in Le Petit Journal, kind of confirming this distinction that I tried to make between the royal on the one hand and the savages on the other. And of course, these are the ridiculing the African kings, including some of the visitors that made it to the European capital at the beginning of the 20th century. I do not have time to go into that. And here is the royal slave, where the trope of the royal slave was actually established with its translation, the slave king, in 1833. In order to account for its circulation, the circulation of the trope in a more modern Black Atlantic and global context, and to distinguish it from the earlier European panoply of images, I propose to use the term Afro-trope. The term is not mine. It was coined by scholars Huey Copeland and Christy Thompson, who define it as, you can read along with me here, as a shorthand way of referring to the recurrent visual forms that have emerged within and become central to the formation of African diasporic culture and identity. Afrotropes, they write, are often translated across various cultural domains as well as transmitted over time and space, accruing particular density at certain moments and seeming to volatilize out of sight at others. Afrotropes, they add, in other words, emerge and remain latent, transformed and deformed in response to the specific social, political, and institutional conditions that inform the experiences of Black people. You can continue reading. Okay, this is a little bit disconcerting to have to be playing with. Okay, all right. Following the lead from Huey Copeland and Christy Thompson, I would like to add the Royal African to their catalog, to the catalog of these recurrent visual forms, and actually I would like to add it to my own catalog, to my own repertoire of these images that continue to problematically pervade and traverse our common imaginaries. I also want with them to insist that Afrotropes are deployed with variable moments of visibility, or as they put it, different levels of density historically and culturally. I think this is particularly true of the Afrotrope of the Black Royal. As I will discuss, its visibility in diasporic culture has not been constant, at times remaining latent, at others re-emerging in full force. In the 20th century, some key moments are actually connected to the intellectual and cultural history of the Black world, including Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and negritude in the early decades of the 20th century. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, Afrocentric thought in the Francophone context that we will see, Créolité as well. Basically, in all these moments, we see the Afrotrope of Black royalty being mobilized for claims of dignity and self-determination. The history of Garveyism, for one, is full of fascinating aristocratic gestures, as Marcus Garvey presented himself to the African-American public and to the Black world as alternatively Black emperor, Black prince, Black Napoleon, and literally ruler of a new African kingdom across the Atlantic. His rhetorics, his politics, and his performances forever inscribed the flamboyant body that you can see here in the imaginary of the diaspora. One can think also of the movement known as Afrocentric Egyptology, embracing pharaonic figures of ancient Egypt, the kingdom of Kush, and the Nubians, and also we can think, starting as early as the 1930s, of the Rastafari movement in Haile Selassie. Whether imagined or real, or invented or based on real historical lineage from Africa, the mobilization of images of Black royals has not gone without debate or without controversy. So now in what follows, I would like to focus on the particular example of the Francophone Caribbean and one of its major authors, Aimé Césaire. So several Black intellectuals from the diaspora, mostly from the US and the Caribbean, have forcefully called for caution about the risks of romanticizing Africa's past, or as Fanon beautifully said in his chapter on in the Wretched of the Earth on national culture, what he calls, I quote, the secret hope of discovering beyond the present wretchedness, beyond this self-hatred, this abdication and denial, of discovering, the secret hope of discovering some magnificent and shining era that redeems us in our own eyes and those of others. So let me spend some time on Aimé Césaire. In his notebook of a return to the native land, the cahier d'un retour au pays natal, considered a manifesto for négritude, Césaire famously defined blackness by opposing it, négritude, by opposing it to European modernity. My négritude, he famously claimed in one of the central moments of the cahier, it's not a tower, nor is it a cathedral. And yet, it can be celebrated as grounds for the new ontology of, I quote, those who invented nothing, ceux qui n'ont rien inventé. Césaire proposed to embrace then the history of low-born conditions and experiences in order to dialectically imagine new modalities of Black pride. Those of the former or actual beggars, the ugly servants, literally and etymologically, the non-noble, the ignoble, like the nègre comique ailé on the tramway. What interests me in recalling Césaire in connection to Black royalty is that alongside this definition comes an explicit mise en garde against the desire to uncover noble African genealogy. And referring to such impulses, he writes in the cahier, that's in French now, et je ris de mes anciennes imaginations puériles. Non, nous n'avons jamais été Amazone du roi du Dahomey, ni prince de Ghana avec 800 chameaux, ni docteur à Tombouctou, Askia le Grand étant roi, ni architecte de Djenné, ni Madi, ni guerrier. Nous ne sentons pas sous les selles la démangeaison de ceux qui tinrent jadis la lance. What we have here is a major point of divergence between Césaire's diasporic négritude and that of the Senegalese Léopold Sédar Senghor, the Senegalese, the African, continental African Léopold Sédar Senghor. While Senghor's poetry often engages in nostalgic praising of pre-colonial beauty, la Reine de Saba, etc., Césaire's diasporic négritude embraces non-nobility as he pays homage to the greatness of the ancient pre-colonial kingdoms, Mali, Djenné, Timbuktu. At the same time, he keeps them as a distance geographically and temporally, and I would add ontologically as well. In order for the new Black subject to emerge in these afterlives of slavery that Césaire invites us to join, the possibility of genealogical connections to illustrious ancestors from Mali, from Sudan, or from Dahomey needs to be definitively foreclosed. A century later, at the height of decolonization, Césaire will actually make these fantasies, these imaginations puériles. So I don't know if he was thinking about Freud at the time or not, but the coincidence is there. He makes these fantasies the subject of a play, La Tragédie du Roi Christophe, in 1963. Years have passed since the days of the cahier. Césaire is not the young student anymore. He's a mature writer and an experienced politician, mayor of Fort-de-France and deputy of Martinique since 1946. He has also turned to theater, drama. The tragedy of King Christophe, his second play after Et les chiens se taisaient et une saison au Congo. In the tragedy of Christophe, Césaire chooses a real Haitian Black king as a central character, whereas, like as we know in A Tempest, he's going to offer the literary world this renewed figure of Caliban, as we know. So briefly on Roi Christophe. Roi Christophe, and I was very happy to hear a beautiful presentation on Roi Christophe earlier. Briefly, he's one of the famous leaders of the Haitian Revolution. Following the death of the first presidents of the Republic, Dessalines, who himself actually became emperor, and Pétion. Christophe became president for 2 years and promptly named himself king in 1811. That's very Wikipedia sort of factual information, but you'll hear echoes later on. Christophe remains in history for his military and political prowesses, but also for the way he modeled from scratch, if I may say, a new aristocracy modeled on British and European in general courts, including 4 princes, 8 dukes, 22 counts, 37 barons, and 14 chevaliers, complete with an armory that is actually in London in the College of Arms. I should have stopped there on my way back. Armory Générale du Royaume d'Haïti, with 87 blazons that he invented, so symbolically very charged. Known also as le roi bâtisseur, Christophe commissioned a number of spectacular monuments, including a palace, le Palais Sans Souci, and a fortress, la Citadelle de la Ferrière, which were admired all over the world during his times, and which are now a lieu de mémoire in Haiti. Facing an imminent popular revolt due precisely to his autocratic excesses, King Christophe committed suicide in his palace in 1820. So Christophe's, this is a portrait of Christophe 1816. It's kept in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. Christophe's demiurgic aspirations ultimately result in the anger of the Haitian people, once again in revolt, and in the total disavowal of the king. Now I'm kind of switching to the play. But the play is based on historical realities. With the king committing suicide in his palace, with the crown prince assassinated a few days later, the queen and the princesses in exile, the final picture exposes a black royalty which literally implodes. Christophe represents then the failure of an impossible chiasm. The prince who becomes a slave, Oronoko, the royal slave, is a possible one. And it's an integral part, as I said earlier, of the real and literary history of the Black Atlantic. By contrast, the slave who became king, like Christophe, remains a tragic parenthesis, as there is no place for him other than in fiction and in performance. Although I just said that his citadel and his fortress now constitute a realm of memory, so perhaps the failure is not total. However, admiring in the play, admiring the fortress that he just built at the end of the first of Act 1, a radiant Christophe exclaims, actually just talks to the citadel, and it's a tower, it's a cathedral, etc., right? Il vit, il corne dans le brouillard, il s'allume dans la nuit, annulation du négrier. And it's very nice in English. It cancels the slave ship, right? So the castle actually, the castle has turned into a ship that allows the king to kind of orient himself and his people in the fog, right? Kind of like an enlightened night. And the fundamental dream of Christophe is expressed here. It cancels the slave ship. Annulation du négrier. In this regard, we can see that the tragedy of King Christophe is a play about respectability, or rather the failure of attaining respectability through royalty. In addition, the play in the 1960s functioned as a cautionary tale on the danger of non-democratic political models at the very moment when intellectuals from the Black world are debating forms of national sovereignty and nation building. And here we could bring up Fanon. yet it is obvious for Césaire with the tragic end that he imagines for Christophe, that nothing can ever cancel the slave ship, right? That the afterlives of slavery need to bring with them the slave ship and the experience of the slave ship. In the post-Césaire generation, and especially in Martinique and Guadeloupe, so I'm now moving to another moment, it's interesting to see yet another royal figure come up, and I missed my slide again. It's okay. So I wanted to show kind of like the king with aspirations of grandeur. That's the first cover of the Présence Africaine edition. And then this new cover with the kind of the sign, not the whole regalia, but the sign of nobility, of course, empty, kind of like signifying the impossibility for the black body to sit on this throne. So that's perhaps what's kind of recurring in his longing for royalty, the desire to sit on a throne, on the royal throne. Okay. So another figure comes up in Caribbean literature, and this time it's a real African king, and we saw it here. It's King Béanzin. So a word on King Béanzin. Béanzin was the last independent king, meaning that the last one to have been established through traditional power structures, in the kingdom of Dahomey. He ruled from 1889 to 1894 on the kingdom of Dahomey, today more or less Benin. He led the resistance to the French colonization during the Dahomey Wars. In 1990, his reign stops in 1894 because he had to surrender to the French. And he was subsequently exiled with his family to Martinique, where he stayed for 12 years. So he was deported. He was in residence in Martinique. He was not a prisoner. He was kind of like free to move around the island, and that's important because there's a whole imaginary of Béanzin in Martinique. So he stayed 12 years. While in Martinique, he pleaded to be repatriated to Africa. And the French government said, yeah, we'll send you back to Africa. And they actually sent him to Algeria in April 1906. And 8 months later, he died. He was in Blida first, and then he died in Algeria. 47 years before Fanon's arrival in Blida. Okay, King Béanzin's trajectory thus figures an amazingly complex Black Atlantic geography of displacement starting in Africa at the end of the 19th century and involving a transcontinental circulation through the French Empire at the turn of the century. The vicissitude of this particular king fascinated the French at the time. There's actually a very interesting article on the celebrity of Béanzin, on the different celebrities of Béanzin. One when he's king and when he's the anti-colonial resistant. But actually, what I just call the vicissitudes of Béanzin have been documented through a series of reportage, articles, etc., and a series of postcards that I'm accumulating. I'm buying them on eBay, showing Béanzin in photos. Some of them have like commentaries on the back and stuff, so I'm kind of working on that right now. But we have here Béanzin. And it's interesting to see what I call the regalia of the king, because there's no crown, right? You saw that, the crown is this kind of symbol. But in this case, there's no crown. So that's one of the postcards, Ex-Roi du Béanzin. And this is a postcard very interestingly kind of exotic, but actually documenting the arrival of Béanzin in Martinique. So there is a ship, but it is not slave ship, but it is a ship of deportation. By the way, the slave ship is an Afrotrope, you know, in the essay that Copeland proposed. Okay, so actually, three of the most major Francophone Caribbean authors of the post-Césaire generation have recast Béanzin in a variety of forms, and I'm going to kind of account for those very quickly here. One is Édouard Glissant, both in the Discours entier and in the Casse du Commandeur, a novel from 1981. Another one is Maryse Condé in Les Derniers Rois Mages, translated as The Last of the African Kings. And finally, Patrick Chamoiseau, with his film co-written with Guy Deslauriers, L'Exil du Roi Béanzin. So in the Discours entier, Édouard Glissant turns Béanzin into an emblem of black Atlantic nomadic condition, calling him Béanzin, miroir de nos exils, in one of the poems that he dedicates to him. I'm going a little bit quickly here to say that in his second novel, published, written probably simultaneously with the Caribbean Discourse in 1981, Glissant imagines a character who's a Martinican who becomes obsessed with Béanzin after he learned or he hears by chance that of the passage of Béanzin in Martinique. So it's like, what? There was an African king in Martinique? But in his research, he's discouraged at every stage to pursue his research, as librarians and teachers, etc., say that it's not worth, it's a research that's not worth pursuing. These are just tales. In 1999, Maryse Condé is also inspired to use an African king as a potential illustrious ancestor for the Caribbean subject. An ever-sharp critique of Afrocentric idealists, Maryse Condé adopts in The Last of the African Kings a satirical perspective to imagine a fictional Caribbean offspring of Béanzin. Right, so we see here that Béanzin arrives in Martinique with two of his wives, and she imagines, and in popular imagination, there are rumors of many offsprings of Béanzin in the Caribbean. So Maryse Condé picks up on this sort of like popular knowledge. Here again, bringing up the King of Dahomey is an opportunity for the Caribbean Condé to expose family romances generated by diasporic subjects. In the book, the Caribbean character ultimately fails to symbolically reconnect with his African ancestor. He fails to demonstrate his paternity, and he fails to impress his Afrocentric wife, who will probably eventually get a divorce because he's not the real royal that she thought she would be. But this is, we don't know for sure at the end. What we know for sure is that Condé's story disqualifies dreams of royal ascendance. Rather, the royal ancestor functions more like a curse, as it condemns the Martinican character to melancholia, depression, and isolation, signaling further a broader, more collective and cultural disconnection with Africa. In both Édouard Glissant's La Casse du Commandeur and in Maryse Condé's Le Dernier Roi Mage, the specter of Béanzin lurks with ambivalence. On the one hand, the authors seem to expose a certain futility in their characters' longing for royalty. Yet on the other hand, their narratives ultimately honor the memory of the exiled African king and his ordeal in Martinique. And they honor as well the traces that he left on the collective imaginary of Martinique, if not the descendants. In Chamoiseau's film, L'Exil du Roi Béanzin, the memory of Béanzin is revived also, but I don't want to talk about it too much because, it involves a kind of a cheesy love story with a Chabine, and it's not very good, so I don't want to do that to Chamoiseau. I respect him very much. But anyway, it was not very successful, but also, but it marks perhaps the moment when in the late 90s, the Afrotrope goes into a phase that I would call latence in the Francophone Caribbean. Interestingly, there are no traces for all the emperors, the kings, and the royalty that mark Haitian history in the 21st century. I would see in Haitian literature, and correct me if I'm wrong, that authors like Evelyne Trouillot, Kate Limars, Yannick Lins, Daniela Ferrière, Edwige Dantica, Mackenzie Orcel, etc., focus on more or urban characters in the quotidian of Port-au-Prince, or on some of the disasters that have marked Haiti, including the earthquake. So no latent or no trace of it. Now, in the first decades of the 21st century, by contrast, and then I'm going to finish quickly. In the first decade of the 21st century, I believe we are now in a moment of high density for the Afrotrope, as Copeland and et al. Would say. So if I fast forward to the 21st century, and if I move to the 21st century, I would locate a re-emergence of the Afrotrope in American popular culture, where Black kings, princes, princesses, and queens have been re-emerging at a particular fast pace, I think. So allow me to give you examples. Ryan Coogler's marvelous production, Black Panther, that introduced the world to the kingdom of Wakanda, and its sequel in 2022. Beyoncé's 2020 musical, the remake of The Lion King, originally commissioned by Disney. The musical is called Black is King. The Woman King by Viola Davis, which earned accolades for its alleged feminist recounting of the accomplishments of the Agojis, Amazons of the 19th century Kingdom of Dahomey. That was in 2022. Very recently, Queen Cleopatra. I haven't seen it, and this one, I don't think I'm gonna watch it. By Jada Pinkett Smith, and this, I say this facetiously, but actually the controversy is already there. It's interesting that it's kind of like reviving debates. Was Cleopatra black, etc. But so far it hasn't been done in a satisfying critical way. And of course, I do not have the slide here, but I cannot end without mentioning the incredible success of the period drama Bridgerton by African-American producer Rhonda Shimes, which is now in its fifth season, I believe. So to try to finish, let me say the following. On one level or another, most of the above have been praised for the aspirational narratives that they provide and for the glorious aesthetics that they offer for new global representations of Blackness. Of Beyoncé's Black is King, for example, one critic writes in the journal Variety, I quote, "Black is King takes us on a journey of remembrance and Black is King takes us on a journey of remembrance and reinvention. It's aspirational and more. It's about the royalty Blacks were and the royalty Blacks continue to be, both in America and in Africa." Commenting different realm, commenting on the success of Black Panther, philosopher Achille Mbembe speaks of a retournement du signe africain. And he writes, en Black Panther, c'est le signe africain qui fait l'objet d'un retournement spectaculaire. Black Panther convoque et remobilise de façon subliminale l'utopie d'une nation nègre. Wakanda, le pays imaginaire au cœur du film, est de ce point de vue la métaphore de la nation nègre puissante et souveraine, dont rêvèrent à des époques et sous des formes différentes Marcus Garvey, ou plus près de nous, Cheikh Anta Diop, et maints penseurs afrocentristes. Indeed, if we follow Achille Mbembe's analysis, Black Panther effectuates a redemptive gesture, but a familiar one in Black cultural and political history. Yet, as much as I want to share Mbembe's enthusiasm, in the final analysis, I remain torn between two ways of interpreting this return or this re-emergence of the Afrotrope of the Black royal in the 21st century. On the one hand, I am all for the retournement du signe africain. I'm even for a réenchantement du réel, a term that Mbembe also uses in the essay. I'm excited as well by the sense of elation that these new aesthetics of Blackness generate as new experiences are imagined across time and cultures. There's no denying the tremendous creativity they attest to and their redemptive power as far as representations of Blackness are concerned. Still, I am bothered by the sort of uncritical embracing of narratives and images, which in fact do little to challenge the representation of Africa as a continent as a whole. What I see is a problematic topography unfolding here where a certain Africa, certain ancestors are claimable. But this Africa is located either in the past or in the future with no little consideration of the present and of the present material conditions of the continent. So I wonder where exactly resides the radicality of some of the so-called inspirational stories, if in the process of empowering some in the diaspora, it leaves intact taxonomies of power and privilege, including for Africa itself. So beyond the dazzling Afrocentric aesthetics they reinvent, what do these incredibly impactful products like the Afrofuturist tale Black Panther or the feminist Woman King ultimately achieve in terms of the retournement? Is it possible to continue to embrace royalty as a model without connecting it to its conditions of possibility, which rely on historical violence to Black bodies, from slave trade to neoliberal capitalism onward? This seems to be especially difficult in the case of Dahomey, and you notice that my examples are from Dahomey, for instance, whose pre-colonial grandeur originates precisely in its active participation in the economy of the slave trade. Finally, at a time when Pan-African festivals like the FESPACO in Burkina Faso, in West Africa, and others are struggling for financial reasons because of regional and global and transnational warfare, the fact that Hollywood seems to gain some monopoly on the representation of Africa, these representations also need to be questioned as we continue to interrogate modes of visibility and empowerment and their alternatives. So to finish, I would like to go to Grayson, the wisdom of Édouard Glissant. This is in 1993 in the Traité du Tout-Monde, and Glissant writes, « Mais ce n'est pas parce que nous avons été fouillés de ces terres comme des ignames écorchés, transportés sur les eaux immenses comme des sacs de gros sel noir, distribués sur des rochers, les îles et le continent comme une saupoudrée de vieux engrais. Non, ce n'est pas une raison, si c'est une raison, ni nécessaire ni suffisante pour prétendre à revenir là, dans ces pays, à y revenir comme si c'était un territoire qui nous est dû, à y paraître comme si les temps s'étaient figés depuis que nos ascendants y furent ainsi ravis par force, à croire y trouver à notre tour une force essentielle, comme si les habitants de ces pays-là n'avaient pas poursuivi depuis ces temps leur chemin et porté leur charge, comme s'ils n'avaient pas poursuivi en vérité, comme s'ils ne changeaient pas jour après jour et toutes les épouvantables nuits. Et nous voudrions, insolents, partager avec eux cette essence et nous réclamer d'eux, comme des référents paralysés, les tenir pétrifiés dans l'éternité de ces temps où nous joignons nos grands-parents. Merci.
Thank you so much, Lydie, for taking us on this journey with you on a circulation of signs and what they offer us or don't offer us. I believe we've got 15 minutes for questions, and they can be in English or French, and people with microphones will find you. Claire has one here.
In English or French? What would you prefer?
I will answer in French.
Okay, then I'll ask in French.
Yeah, thank you. You talked in French this morning. Yeah.
Oui, en premier, je voulais vous remercier pour cette présentation absolument éblouissante. Et visiblement, il y a un petit penchant pour la royauté pendant ce colloque. Alors, je voulais juste souffler Bernard Dadier et Béatrice du Congo, qui est une pièce sur la royauté, mais de manière... c'était quelques années après Césaire, durant la période africaine où les pays post-indépendance avaient commencé à dégringoler. Et c'est une satire, c'est ce qui est assez intéressant sur cette approche de la royauté. Mais ma question, c'est sur... Parce que vous avez parlé des conditions of possibility for royalty. Je ne sais pas si ça va être un peu à côté de la plaque, mais est-ce que vous pouvez situer un peu Meghan Markle dans tout ça?
Ok.
Parce que je sais que ce n'est pas une référence de la littérature, mais quand même, c'est quelqu'un qui a trouvé une impossibilité dans le contexte de la royauté aujourd'hui.
Oui. Merci. Bon, donc, c'est dommage que je ne puisse pas choisir entre Bernard Dadier et Meghan Markle, mais bon, sur les figures et les récits impliquant des personnages royaux réels ou non en Afrique, il y en a plein dans la littérature africaine, en fait, et le choix que j'avais fait, c'était celui de diaspora, c'est pour ça que j'insistais sur le outside of Africa. Parce que dans ce cas-là, ça serait une autre étude. Il y a effectivement Chaka, comment ça s'appelle, Paul Azoumé, Dogisimi, Kondo le requin. Enfin, il y en a énormément. Donc ça, c'est le domaine plutôt africain où des figures royales africaines sont récupérées par des auteurs africains. Mais merci pour Dadier, je ne l'avais pas. Béatrice du Congo, et j'aurais dû savoir, parce que voilà, je ne suis pas de descendance royale, mais congolaise quand même. Bon, bref, Meghan Markle, qu'est-ce que vous voulez de moi? Quelle réponse est-ce que vous voulez de moi? Je ne sais pas. Enfin, le trône du roi Christophe est vide, son palais est en ruine, etc. D'une certaine manière, elle n'est plus sur un trône non plus. Enfin, elle n'a pas eu cette possibilité de rester dans la permanence, dans la continuité de cette généalogie. Elle est exclue, elle est marginalisée. Mais je ne sais pas vraiment comment analyser. Je ne sais pas vraiment comment l'analyser. Je suis désolée. Voilà, je ne sais pas. Je me pose la question en revanche avec Bridgerton, etc. et le Queen Charlotte, hein, c'est-à-dire la suite, pas la suite, mais la tangente de Bridgerton et cette jeune reine qui est à peu près de la couleur de Meghan Markle, etc., qui pourrait un peu... Je me demande, je suis sûre qu'il y a quelque chose, il faut que j'y réfléchisse. Voilà, c'est ça ma réponse.
Merci, c'était super intéressant. Alors ma question, elle n'est pas encore complètement formulée, mais c'est sur ce trope, as you said, of like the African royalty and generally how it's been, en général, comment ça a été mobilisé dans les projets de la diaspora africaine. Et moi, il me semble quand même que, surtout aujourd'hui, on voit que c'est un modèle incroyablement capitaliste et démobilisateur politiquement parlant. Et et en fait, ce que j'ai trouvé vraiment super intéressant dans votre généalogie, d'une certaine façon, c'est que on parle rarement de la façon dont c'est arrivé à travers certaines représentations. Et en fait, je me demande si, parce que vous l'avez un peu évoqué, mais j'adorerais si vous pouviez en parler un peu plus, si au moment où, dans les années 60, il y avait d'un côté le mouvement afrocentrique aux États-Unis qui retournait vers peut-être plus l'approche de Garvey, l'approche qui reprenait comme ça ces figures royales, si c'était un peu la même chose dans la Caraïbe francophone, mais aussi si déjà à ce moment-là on voit des oppositions et des critiques de ce point de vue-là plutôt anticapitaliste, libérateur, en mode on veut pas être des rois. Et si on pouvait en parler un peu, parce que j'ai l'impression qu'aujourd'hui quand même on a une façon très ahistorique d'en parler. Et on se retrouve avec les mêmes discours qu'il y avait à l'époque, mais bon, je suis sûre qu'on les a critiqués à l'époque, donc je comprends pas pourquoi on ressasse tout le temps ce même débat. Voilà.
Ouais. Merci pour cette question, c'est extrêmement intéressant. Ça me donne l'occasion d'abord de parler de ces deux ères que j'ai un peu juxtaposées entre d'un côté la littérature un peu des élites, etc., et puis la culture populaire qui est, dans le cas que j'ai évoqué, c'est plutôt la culture populaire américaine. Et là, je pense par exemple à... Bon, vous avez vu Basquiat et la couronne de Basquiat, qui renvoie à la question de authorship et d'une détermination à percer dans un certain milieu, etc., d'une confiance en soi qui réaffirme avec la répétition de cette couronne, donc un motif absolument central chez Basquiat. Mais d'un autre côté, si on prend le motif de l'or et de la couronne et la manière dont ils sont mobilisés, par exemple dans le hip-hop et le rap, etc., là, c'est très américain, c'est très ancré dans une culture très de consommation capitaliste, d'ostentation de moyens, de richesses, de premier monde, etc., et donc très problématique dans ce sens-là. Voilà. Et puis concernant l'époque panafricaine, bien sûr, bon, j'ai choisi l'exemple de Garvey parce que je le trouve fascinant, parce que dans l'histoire du garveyisme, il y a aussi beaucoup de faux princes. Garvey lui-même est accusé d'être un imposteur, il accuse les vrais Africains d'être des imposteurs, donc il y a une sorte de ballet de faux princes très intéressant. Mais il y a aussi un débat, pour revenir à votre question, avec W.E.B. Du Bois, par exemple, qui traite de manière très xénophobe Marcus Garvey d'antillais un peu sauvage, justement, et un autre américain, son nom m'échappe maintenant, c'est pas Langston Hughes, mais Langston Hughes était sévère aussi. Langston Hughes, qui lui-même a récupéré la figure de Christophe, du roi Christophe par ailleurs, qui accuse Garvey dans des termes très forts de aping royalty, donc en renvoyant encore une fois le corps de Garvey à un sauvage. Et donc Du Bois qui l'accuse, mais qui lui, W.E.B. Du Bois, va produire ce qu'il appelle un de ses récits préférés, qui s'appelle Black Princess. Mais alors lui, il va imaginer une princesse indienne, etc. Donc il est lui aussi dans cette espèce de rhétorique, mais qu'il estime lui récupérer de manière plus sophistiquée que la parade et l'ostentatoire de Garvey. Donc bien sûr, ces débats, ils traversent tout le panafricanisme. C'est pour ça que je pensais qu'avec Césaire, on pense que le débat clos, quand il dit non, jamais, etc. Mais en fait, le débat ressurgit. Le débat ressurgit tout le temps. Beaucoup moins en ce moment, je trouve. C'est pour ça que ça m'embête que ce soit un peu uncritical, comme je le disais.
Thank you very much. Something that struck me, which I think would be very obvious to other people with more knowledge of the art historical context, but something that struck me looking at this is how in the traditional iconography of royalty, visually, there's so much that's military. You know, I was suddenly struck by that, seeing those images that and that sort of the relationship of power to legitimate violence and the monopoly of violence and so on. And then the photographs, by contrast, seem quite secularizing, as it were, and well, secularizing, but sort of had moved away from that. But anyway, I just wondered if you could say more really about so with this one, there's the gun, and there are always these elements of it. It seemed less present in the writing, so I don't know if those different traditions of representation diverge in that respect. So what the elements of this kind of topos of royalty, whether they're different in the different media and what the specificities are in the visual medium. I guess that's what I was wondering.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I understand that you're talking about about European iconography and repertoire in a sense more.
Yes, but I suppose
Oui.
some of the images you showed as
Oui.
well, I mean, they're obviously borrowing from that.
Oui.
Which speaks to the influence of European power, but that's part of what it brings with it,
Oui.
is that sense of their legitimate relationship to violence, potentially, I suppose.
Mais c'est très intéressant parce qu'en fait, donc comme je disais, il y a une tradition d'échanges diplomatiques aussi, de visiteurs, enfin les rois, des rois africains, pas des roitelets, hein, le roi africain, c'est pas un roitelet, hein, le roitelet c'est celui dont on se moque au théâtre de boulevard. Qui rencontrent des diplomates quand ils vont en Europe, qui reçoivent des diplomates, qui reçoivent des envoyés français sur leur terre. Et ce qu'il ne faut pas oublier, c'est qu'eux aussi se livrent à des démonstrations, des performances, enfin quand ils savent qu'ils reçoivent des envoyés français. Ou quand ils se déplacent avec des cours, ils font des démonstrations de pouvoir, de puissance, de grandeur militaire, ils sortent l'or, ils sortent les richesses, etc. Donc les démonstrations sont en fait dans les deux sens, quand il y a une sorte de compétition aussi, de majesté, y compris, ça c'est plutôt au XIXe siècle, une majesté par exemple dans le cas du Dahomey, qui va se calquer sur la majesté française. Donc les voyageurs vont arriver, ça c'est dans les récits de voyage que j'ai eu l'occasion de lire, et dire « Oh mais mon Dieu, mais ils sont pas par terre, ils ont du velours, ils ont des... » Voilà. Mais c'est parce que les échanges et les copiages datent de la période prémoderne, bien sûr. Enfin, early modern, je veux dire. Oui. Donc les prouesses et les performances vont effectivement dans les deux sens. Dans les récits de voyage, les descriptions sont très détaillées. Sont très détaillées, en particulier de la dynastie des Dahoméens, de Glélé, Guézo, etc., parce qu'il y a une masse d'archives. Après, dans le contexte, je ne parlais pas de Chamoiseau parce que son film est vraiment médiocre. Il n'y a aucun effort de costume, par exemple. Il n'y a aucun effort sur les costumes. Et si vous regardez le Black is King, le Beyoncé, le Hollywood, etc., Woman King reçoit des prix, enfin, et ce sont des prix de meilleurs costumes, etc., période, etc. Donc c'est l'effort aussi de cette esthétisation des corps qui est récompensé. Plus que...
Merci beaucoup. Je voulais juste rebondir sur l'avant-dernière question, parce que quand je l'ai entendu, pour moi, c'était précisément le contraire, parce que au Brésil, la royauté noire a été un facteur de mobilisation politique, et la première révolte d'esclaves à portée révolutionnaire n'a été rendue possible que parce qu'il y avait une princesse qui voulait instaurer une monarchie musulmane au Brésil. Donc, je voulais vous poser la question de la spécificité des Afro-tropes dans l'espace francophone par rapport au reste de la diaspora, surtout en ce qui concerne la royauté, parce qu'on est quand même en dialogue avec un pays qui a coupé la tête des rois, oui. En opposition à des pays qui ont toujours une monarchie comme l'Angleterre, l'Espagne et le Portugal.
Oui. C'est sûr, et merci de me diriger vers l'espace brésilien. J'ai précisément une étudiante qui est en train de faire une recherche pour moi cet été, puis on parlait de Pelurino tout à l'heure, où il y a aussi ces images de rois un peu messianiques, de princes messianiques qui reviennent. Je ne sais plus où je voulais aller en répondant à votre question, mais j'avais votre réponse. Oui, dans le domaine francophone, finalement, quand je disais que la tragédie du roi Christophe, c'est une sorte d'avertissement, une sorte de cautionary tale, Césaire est député, etc., quand il met en garde contre ce qu'il perçoit peut-être comme des dérives potentielles ou des risques dans ce moment de décolonisation, il l'expose sous la forme de cette tragédie à l'issue de laquelle on dirait que la seule forme possible, hein, ce peuple qui s'est révolté et qui a acculé Christophe au suicide dans son palais, la seule forme, c'est la démocratie. La seule forme, c'est la République. Césaire est un député, comme je dis, c'est pas le jeune étudiant fougueux, etc., qui a des tâches, qui a une Martinique à continuer à construire, qui a une représentation à assurer auprès de la République. Et il me semble qu'il insiste sur ce régime démocratique qu'est la République, précisément, en excluant pas simplement le symbole, l'allégorie, l'emblème, etc., mais aussi la forme, le choix politique de la monarchie contre la République française qu'il représente.
I think I'm going to have to call it there because dinner and dancing await. So all that remains is to thank you, Lydie, for your excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydie. Sorry, it's me again. Just to say, if you're joining us for dinner, that's back in the hotel restaurant, dancing afterwards. No injuries, please. If you have an allergy or an intolerance, that the restaurant do know about that, but they obviously don't know what you look like. So if you can make yourself known to the staff as they come round, that would smooth things along. Thanks very much.